Many things can be sourced back to the 1960s that we now consider nostalgic. Tie-dye, anti-establishmentarianism, but the greatest trend to spawn from that decade was the spaghetti western. A new smash hit would reach the big screen practically every year. Once Upon a Time in the West, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Since then, the pony that is the western genre has travelled a long way in the barren desert, with nary a watering hole in sight. This also applies to the video game space. Last year's release, Red Dead Redemption 2, is the exception, when it offered a much more realistic take on the genre. Well, for a AAA game at least, but there's been very little action in the Old West besides. Let's just mosey on over to the Western video game page on Wikipedia and see what we find. 130 games. Not bad at all. Surely there are just as many westerns as sci-fi and fantasy romps. Okay, not quite. Why is it that these genres are so bloated with new releases, but we've seen very few high-profile western titles outside of Red Dead? You could argue that their fictional origins allow for greater creative freedom through reinterpretation and genre mashing, but there's no reason the Old West couldn't receive a similar treatment. Perhaps we're still waiting for that fated game that will reinvigorate the genre by bucking trends and cliches in a dramatic fashion. Call of Juarez Gunslinger is not that game. In fact, it celebrates its tall tales of train robbers and bounty hunters to its fullest extent, making it one of the most enthusiastic westerns that I've ever encountered. Passion for this now malign setting seeps from every facet of its design. The game almost operates as an appeal, an attempt to make more fans of the genre by making the core gameplay as euphoric as possible. Gameplay is fast and frantic, with headshots almost always rewarded with an instant kill. Enemies explode into walls of blood as a points number flashes and they drop in slow motion to truly emphasize that yes, they are very dead. Though the slow motion meter is standard fare, its cousin, the sense of death mechanic, is much more intriguing. If an enemy fires a killing shot when you're on low health, you'll be given the chance to lean away from it and return the favor. This is by far my favourite addition to the corridor shooter formula, as granting such a generous safety net gently nudges the player out of cover more often and into more risky scenarios. Additional abilities are acquired through 3 separate skill trees, each of which complements a different build and playstyle. The Gunslinger, capable of dual-wielding revolvers and racking up high-score multipliers. The Ranger, the expert sharpshot who's good with a rifle. And the Trapper, the aggressive type, who likes to get people up close and personal with their shotgun. Though quite a few are simple stat modifications, it manages to throw in some curveballs, like a momentary slow-mo effect when aiming down sights, or the ability to split thrown dynamite into 3 pieces. I especially enjoy the skill which makes it easier to shoot dynamite in mid-air, and the one that encourages you to reload faster by mashing the button, as these have a much more direct impact on your moment-to-moment interactions. I recorded my keyboard for some of this footage to demonstrate what I mean, and if you can still hear me, then that is incredible! Analysing the waveform from an entire level of gameplay shows how much more active you need to be. The core controls are loose and fast, exactly what you would expect from a gunslinger, but they do fall short in some places. Leaping across gaps can often prove fatal, as there doesn't seem to be a jump grace period. This is a small degree of forgiveness that can actually make the game feel a little more responsive, but Call of Juarez Gunslinger lacks this feature. The first-person perspective makes it harder to tell precisely where you stand, and looking down before each and every gap would slow the pacing dramatically. Though this is a small criticism, it is more of a pain when you consider the meticulous care that has gone into the flow of each level. Most of them jump between open corridor shooting, boss battles, and dueling minigames. but each component persists long enough that it doesn't feel rushed. The progression of each has been finely crafted to keep you engaged, and I often found myself immediately eager to jump straight into the next level. The duels are an effective bookend to many of these levels, requiring you to manage your hand position and aiming simultaneously, all while the tension slowly builds. Not only are the duels highly appropriate references to the Western films of old, they also introduce some slight pacing whiplash, pulling you back to gradually build tension to a final release. And this makes completing levels a wonderfully satisfying sensation. The game has several systems in place to keep you coming back. There's the collectible nuggets of truth to be found, and there's also a heavy emphasis on score attacks, with every defeated enemy or interesting combo providing a large points display. However, there isn't much benefit to achieving a high score beyond bragging rights. The New Game Plus and difficulty options are more convincing, as it allows you to fill out your unfinished skill tree as you play. The leveling system is designed to let you complete more or less one skill tree in one completion, which means that you can try new playstyles on reruns. The weapon-specific benefits found in these trees also encourage you to swap your arsenal around for the return trips. Gunslinger is about 5 hours long the first time through, and shorter in subsequent playthroughs. I personally find this an ideal length, especially at a budget price. The game hasn't been padded out with filler content, and so it is perfectly possible to pick up the game again and complete it in an afternoon. Under the game's thick coating of rootin' tootin' point and shootin' is more or less everything that you would expect in a linear FPS campaign, even down to the turret segments which have been rethemed as Gatling gun segments. Gunslinger does not try to reinvent the wheel, instead it relies on it heavily to support its stage wagon. During shootouts you may notice a water barrel bursting and forming a puddle on the floor, or a slight haze from rising smoke, the type of details used repeatedly in Western films to emphasize the action and destruction. Pallets of wood can be shot through in splintering blasts. There are also incredibly charming bonus animations that sometimes occur just after a fight. This detail is completely unnecessary in a gameplay sense, and the extra animation work is baffling, considering it may not even be seen at all by button mashers. As a result, it's one of the most defining details of this game. Though the soundtrack isn't exactly memorable enough to track down, it certainly gets you pumped up for a brawl, and I did find myself recognizing some pieces on return playthroughs. In general, audio work is wonderful, with punchy gunshots and highly aggressive AI filling out the sound. You could argue that it fills out the sound too much, as between the guns, enemy shouts and narration, it can sometimes become overwhelming. The visual style is a real winner. Even if westerns were a dime a dozen, Gunslinger would be a gold nugget. Heavy shading and bold outlines give it a comic book-esque appearance, and the illustration theme is taken further with frequent brushstroke transitions. This art style serves more than just to make it visually distinct in screenshots. It serves a narrative benefit by making the game appear fictional. The entirety of Gunslinger is told through the eyes of a narrator, Silas Greaves. This narration persists through the levels themselves, giving them an effective sense of progression. Every stage tells a miniature story, one which can change in front of you, as Silas recalls a flanking route he hadn't noticed at first, or a body which gives you some much needed ammo. Gunslinger is an example of how flashback-heavy storytelling should be done, as it never holds the pacing hostage. One of the more unusual applications of this narrative style places you directly in the center of a firefight at the beginning of a level, dodging a fatal bullet as your first interaction. You claw your way up the slope through a horde of bandits, finally reaching a saloon decorated with bodies. Upon a slight retelling, you're transported back in time to just before that engagement, which means you're mentally prepared upon reaching the slope. Now familiar with it, you push through with much more confidence to find the saloon heavily populated. You clear it out, thereby explaining where the bodies came from. In a linear narrative, this would make no sense, But as you were following Silas's train of thought, it's as if you really did jump backwards in the story with him, to provide some context. In general, his tales of encountering many of the era's greatest outlaws and legends not only makes it approachable for those unfamiliar with westerns, it also makes the story less about what actually happened and more about what Silas says happened.
Wait, so you were friends with Billy the Kid?
Yeah, sort of.
As he recalls his tale over some drinks, his fellow patrons question how much of it is truth and what has been stretched to make for a better story. This allows for the best narrative segment in the game, when the Dalton brothers attempt to rob two banks at the same time. The event is first depicted by Ben, one of the older patrons of the saloon. He describes how the civilians, including himself, took up arms and stormed the front of the building to take the brothers down.
There's more to it than that. I read all about that day, so I know for a fact that it went down very differently.
Then you replay the same event but retold by the younger of the men. The deputy marshals are holding the door as legendary bounty hunter Silas Greaves opts to leap across onto the roof and enter from above. It's a glamorous tale, but it's one likely embellished by dime novels. Finally, Silas tells it from his own perspective. In this version, the deputies prove useless at keeping the brothers contained in the bank, and as a result, Silas has to chase them down through the town. Taking the same location and giving the player different starting points and paths prevents it from becoming repetitive. As a result, this segment is an effective demonstration of just how much history can be influenced by its storyteller, and this theme is persistent through the entire experience. Silas will contradict himself by suggesting a particular outlaw was apprehended alive, which, if you shoot here, would make sense. However, the game also allows you to shoot here, a clearly fatal shot.
Yeah, I didn't kill Jesse James. Yeah, I didn't kill Jesse James.
The story constantly shifts around as the other patrons criticize or question Silas's storytelling, and nuggets of truth found throughout the levels give the true historical details of the many events and outlaws of the time. I usually don't care much for collectibles that provide extended reading, but I was always eager to read these, as they're just the right length to provide some interesting background without overstaying their welcome. They also play directly into the core themes of the game, as they inform you of just how much Silas has exaggerated his tales.
There were Indians?
No. I just wanted to make sure Steve was paying attention. Now, where was I?
You were following the Daltons through a swamp?
That's right. See, Steve? Dwight's paying attention.
Gunslinger does an excellent job of telling multiple stories at once, while managing to keep them consistent with one another. As it jumps between different individual tales, it also tells the greater story of Silas's redemption, all while balancing the concept of truth and validity in the legends of the Wild West. It's one of the most unique and effective methods of delivering on a storytelling theme that I've encountered in a game, and it greatly benefits from its playable nature, as the narrative dichotomy is further emphasized when you're personally strung along the middle.
Heart was pounding like a sledgehammer. I knew that failure meant boom. Then, finally, at the last moment. Whew. Of course, I was successful, or clearly I wouldn't be talking to you folks here today.
I think this concept has incredible potential to be returned to in the future, as you can take other approaches to this theme. For example, by using more dynamic systems, you could have the player construct the story, with the narrator adjusting their tale on the fly to match, like the Stanley Parable, but more for constructing a cohesive tale than for the purposes of comedy. The likelihood of such a sequel is questionable. Gunslinger released in 2013 to favourable reviews, but it was a budget title following up Call of Juarez: The Cartel, a game which disastrously failed to bring the series into a modern day setting. Gunslinger was an appropriate response to the Cartel's failure, by bringing the franchise back to its roots under a lower risk business model, a cheaper digital-only title. However, the franchise's name may have been soured too much for a smaller scale successor to pull it back from the brink. It also arrived a little too early for the revival of the AA game scene, which it would have more or less perfectly slotted into. At the time, the developers Techland were highly occupied with their attempts to turn Dead Island into a franchise, and since then, they've been busy creating Dying Light 2. Though there is a chance the Call of Juarez franchise could see a return, especially with the direction Gunslinger introduced, I don't imagine it's very likely. In a way, it's fitting. Just like the Western genre it paid so much love to, the Call of Juarez franchise has faded away into relative obscurity, waiting for the opportunity to make its return.